Hello, everyone. It's Sarah. I'm here for you with another live stream. Today, we're going to be talking about perfectionism. So, this actually comes at a very strange time for me. So, those of you who follow me and the Girl in Space podcast on Twitter may have seen earlier that I was posting about some depression I've been dealing with. And that's not what this video is about, but it was just a very interesting juxtaposition between posting that and then knowing that tonight I had a live stream to do where I would have to brush my hair and put on makeup and smile. And so I'm genuinely smiling right now because this is a place of good energy. I'm excited to see you. But there is just a really interesting juxtaposition between how I've been feeling and what I need to present to people. So for those of you who are joining us, welcome. I'm super glad you're here. Hi, hello, wonderful, lovely people. So we're going to be talking about perfectionism and imposter syndrome and fear and all sorts of things that we as podcasters, that we as creative people have to deal with on a daily basis, a monthly basis. I think for me, it's daily. And it never actually goes away, which is why we need to talk about dealing with it instead of banishing it forever. So if you have ever found yourself saying, oh, I am such a perfectionist and I wish I wasn't, or I'm dealing with imposter syndrome, or I'm just not blank enough to do this, this is the chat for you. You're getting in your own way, just like so many of us, hundreds, thousands of other podcasters and creatives get in their own way. Today we're going to talk about what perfectionism is and what it means for podcasters. We're going to talk about what imposter syndrome is and what it means for podcasters. And then we're going to talk about the underlying connector between these two, what do we want to call them? Mental states, states of existence, afflictions, syndromes. I'm not 100% sure what to call them, but they exist and they're real and we deal with them. So jumping in, perfectionism is this hard little frozen ideal that everything we create needs to live up to a perfect standard, a standard of perfection. This is born of a lot of things. We're going to talk about where it comes from in just a little bit, but this is essentially, okay, if this isn't perfect, this thing I'm creating, if this isn't perfect, I cannot possibly release it to the world. If I can't accept this thing I've made because it's not perfect, or I can't release it because people will judge me, people will see it and think less of me. And I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Sarah. I am a recovering perfectionist. I think that our culture venerates perfectionism in the same way that it venerates being busy. It's a good thing to make things well, right? It's a good thing to have a lot of work to do because it means we're important, and it means that we're capable, and it means that the company that's employing us is justified in paying us a salary or a paycheck. I remember before I left the working world, well, I still work really, really hard. But before I left the world of having a job and going to work in an office, I would go to job interviews, and there was always that one question in the job interview of, oh gosh, like give us something, so you spend the job interview talking about how great you are, or at least trying to. And then there's always that one question like, hey, what's one thing that you're terrible at? Or what's one fatal flaw? Or what's your worst aspect? And very early on, um, I realized that I could get away with saying that I was a perfectionist in these job interviews. And so I would say, "Oh, I'm a perfectionist," which means that, oh, I'm just not satisfied with anything until it's perfect. And that's exactly what the HR people or whoever was doing the hiring or the interview, that's exactly what they want to hear. They want to hear that I'm just too good at my job. Ah, that's such garbage. But that went over well, and people like that. And it validated this notion that I had that perfect was the expectation. Perfect was what other people wanted and needed from me and my work. Mm. Uh, if this is something that you deal with, let me know in the comments here. I've got the comments open for this live video, and I'd just be curious. Just go ahead and type yes, or I am also a perfectionist, or what have you. Um, I hydrate and I like dehydrate at the same time. This is coffee and this is water. So I'm just going to be very well balanced here. Excuse me. Perfectionism is something that I like to talk about because we need to get over it in stages. We need to, stage one, get away from the veneration of perfectionism. We need to get away from the notion that this is a good thing, just like we need to distance ourselves from being busy. I see several people saying, yes, I am a perfectionist. Lissa says, I always feel like an imposter, which we're going to talk about in just a second. This distancing of ourselves from this perfect ideal, we need to do it in stages. So first is recognizing that it is not a good thing. Perfectionism is not a good thing because at the end of the day, it doesn't promote better work. In fact, it holds us back from releasing work that is technically very good or even great. It's one of those things that we don't know is holding us back because we don't know that it's a bad thing. So first we need to understand that perfectionism is not a good thing. Now, this is different from doing the best you can with what you have. You are always going to want to do the best you can with what you have. That's just what we strive for as humans. But if you strive for perfect, some bad things are going to happen. And I'm going to talk about this just briefly. Because, well, I kind of do want to talk to you guys all night. I love talking to people. I get really nervous about these live streams, which is, I was talking with Jimmy, who's here earlier today, about how nervous I get about these live streams because I'm a recovering perfectionist and live streams are just so inherently imperfect. And I lose my train of thought very easily, and I'm easily distracted because I have adult ADD. And this is my brain. But perfectionism being a bad thing is what we were just talking about. And Perfectionism and the need to be perfect, or this pressure to deliver perfection, comes from our expectations. It's expectations that we have set for ourselves and expectations that we have seen others live up to. And it's expectations that other people have set for us. So there's this constant judging competition going on where we learn how to set the bar for our own work based on what we see around us. The School of Life has a fantastic video about perfectionism called The Perfectionist Trap. And it's one of my favorite videos on YouTube. I watch it all the time. I share it with people all the time. Basically, it talks about how society sets up this measuring stick that we need to measure up to. What we do is we create our podcasts, we write, we draw, we make sculptures. And what we're doing while we're creating it is we're comparing our work in progress that we secretly know all of the flaws to with somebody else's finished masterpiece. And this is something I struggled with. Before I was a podcaster, I was a writer, and I'm still a writer. As you can see, I have my show about writing. I would go to a bookstore and I would just feel so much despair because looking around at all these beautiful published books, what was I creating in comparison to all this stuff? And you can see how it starts to tie into imposter syndrome. But what I was doing was comparing my unfinished, unpublished scribblings to a finished product. And this is important because those things should not be compared. This video that I was just talking about, The Perfectionist Trap, the video talks about a sculptor and what you see and what you don't see in the process. And what you see in the process is just the very end. You see the triumphant finish. You see a beautiful sculpture. What you don't see is the 900 rejected, chiseled pieces of marble that the sculptor screwed up and that they practiced on and that they discarded. You don't see the sum. You just see the total. You don't see everything that goes into it. You just see the finished product. You don't see the blood and sweat and tears, a lot of tears, that go into creating something. We just sit down and we expect that we will create a beautiful, polished thing. And that's not how it works. And that's hard for us to deal with too. That's really hard for us to deal with. It's frustrating for a lot of us not to be able to sit down and immediately be a master of something. This is really hard for me. I am not used to doing video, and doing live streaming is really hard for me. Like, I was having panic attacks and some existential crises going into this. And it's gonna take a lot more work for me to be comfortable with this. It's gonna take a lot more work before I feel like a legitimate person who does video things. And maybe you're feeling something like that right now with your podcasting. I told you that I was going to talk about the surprising place where perfectionism comes from. And we talked a little bit about comparison, and we talked a little bit about other people's expectations, and we talked a little bit about our own expectations. But what we haven't talked about is fear. Perfectionism, at the end of the day, comes from fear. Fear that we're not good enough. Fear that if we release something, it might be judged, and thereby we will be judged and found lacking. Perfectionism comes from the need to continue working on something until it's perfect, which is something that will never happen, which tacitly gives us permission to never release our work. Does that make sense? Oh gosh. I just glanced at the comments and so many beautiful people are like, you're doing great. Oh, you guys are so wonderful. Thank you. This is not a perfect live stream. Your podcasts are not going to be perfect podcasts. And that's okay. Because really what matters? What matters is, well, I'm not going to tell you what matters for you. What matters for me is connecting with people and making a genuine connection and looking you in the eyes and telling you that perfectionism comes from fear. Perfectionism comes from this mean little thing inside of us that judges us and tells us we're not enough and that we won't be loved or admired and we won't be worthy of love or admiration until what we create is better than anything anyone else has ever created. We hold ourselves back by being perfectionists. And so the sooner that we can learn how to deal with this, personally and culturally, the more we can show that creation is a messy process, the more that creators are willing to be role models for the messy process, which is something that none of us are good at because we all feel like we need to look like experts. We all feel like we need to look perfect in everything we do. It's hard. It's hard to be vulnerable. It's hard to come out and say, I'm not perfect. It's hard, especially with podcasting, because if you have a podcast, you're supposed to be the expert, right? If you have a video, you're supposed to be the expert. Do the best you can with what you have. There's a beautiful Maya Angelou quote that I don't know off the top of my head, but she talks about do what you can until you know better, and then do better. And it's just a process. Move forward, enjoy the journey. Sounds very cliche, but it's true. What I'd like you to do is, if this is something that you struggle with, if perfectionism is something that you struggle with, I talked about a few mind shifts. The first one is understanding that perfection is not possible. It's not possible. We're not perfect. I'm not perfect. Unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. You are not perfect. You're pretty cool and you're good at what you do, but you're not perfect. And the podcasts that you create will never be perfect. You can like them and they can be pretty freaking amazing and they can be fantastic and they can be award winning, but there's no platonic ideal for a podcast. And I want to be really clear about that. That's where a lot of our ideas about perfect come from, is this idea that there is some model of podcast out there somewhere that is the perfect podcast. And there's not. Because we don't create podcasts to put on a pedestal in a museum. We create podcasts to serve people. We create podcasts to communicate. And there is no ideal podcast. There is no perfect podcast because every podcast listener Every audience needs something different from you. So you can't say that 20,000 hertz is the perfect podcast when your audience is in need of Misadventure by Death or Tides or any other podcast that you can think of. People need different things. There's not just one size that fits all. There's not just one answer. There's no perfect podcast. You just do the best you can with what you have and focus on serving and helping your audience and living out the purpose that your podcast was established to do. This is a really good cup of coffee. So I don't know if that makes you feel better or not, knowing that nobody has a perfect podcast. There may be podcasts that you enjoy and podcasters who you admire, but there's no such thing as a perfect podcast. Does that make you feel better or worse? Tied in with perfectionism is this other thing that a lot of creatives deal with called imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome is sort of, it's on a separate end of a spectrum from perfectionism in a way. So imposter syndrome is this thing that makes us feel like an imposter or a fraud or a phony, despite the fact that we are intelligent and capable human beings. So it's really funny because right now I am perfectly capable of delivering a live stream to you. Like I have a room in which to sit. I have a cup of coffee from which to sip. I have technology that is allowing me to beam myself into your home or onto your phone or wherever you are. And yet I feel wildly inadequate to do this. I'm just going to be honest with you. I feel like a huge imposter. Who am I to get on a video screen and talk about podcasting, right? I just, we're constantly terrified that somebody is going to call us out. If you've ever struggled with imposter syndrome, you know what I'm talking about. There's this constant fear that somebody is going to be like, hey, wait a minute. You don't know what you're doing. You're figuring this out as you go along. You fraud. You imposter. Have you ever felt that way? Let me know in the comments if imposter syndrome is something you have ever struggled with. I know I have. I still struggle with it. I have 2 podcasts, and I still, from time to time, will be like, right, but should I be podcasting? Am I really the best person to do this? Should I really be writing stories and talking about this stuff? I keep waiting for the day when somebody, like when I'm giving a talk or something somewhere, when someone just like stands up in the audience and like everybody around them goes quiet and they just yell out. Like, I think I'm thinking of that scene in The Princess Bride when she's having her dream wedding and that old crone stands up and goes, you. I'm waiting for somebody to do that while I'm at a talk and be like, you don't know what you're doing. You don't have a degree in podcasting. You're not Dr. Podcast. You're just Sarah. You just sit in front of a microphone and you tell stories. Maybe you feel like this too. Maybe you're waiting for that too. Maybe you're waiting for someone to call you out. Ooh. Pete says, I'm always curious as to who has made it to a level where they don't feel like an imposter. So does Steven Spielberg feel like an imposter? I'm going to say probably yes. Because here's a weird thing. You will never feel equal. And I'm saying this based on my own experience, so maybe I'm talking out of my butt, but I've never felt equal to any accolades that my work has gotten. And maybe that's imposter syndrome, or maybe that's low self-esteem and low self-worth. But I bet there are days when Steven Spielberg goes home and he sits on his probably very expensive couch, and he just stares at the wall. Unless he lives in a very rich person's house that doesn't have walls, and they've invented something new for rich people, which, maybe they have. But Steven Spielberg sits down and stares at the wall and is like, what have I done with my day? I went for a walk. I ate some ice cream. That doesn't sound very Steven Spielberg-y. What am I doing? Who am I to be Steven Spielberg? I may be projecting a little bit, but I would bet that every single person out there, every single creative person, every single person who creates work and puts it in the world to be judged and walks around in the world with any kind of label or pretense feels like an imposter sometimes. I'm sitting here thinking about how personal I should get with you, because I have a lot of examples about this in my life, but we'll save those for another live stream. So there's a spectrum here between thinking I am the greatest podcaster that has ever lived and ever will live, and then on the other side of the spectrum thinking I am a piece of human garbage. Right? Neither of those is healthy. I don't want you thinking either of those. One is narcissism and one is imposter syndrome. What I do want you to know is that none of us really know what we're doing. None of us feel equal to the task. None of us feel equal to the label or the name. And if you do feel equal to that, then tell me your secrets, because I want to know. What I can tell you is that even when you don't feel like it, you deserve to be podcasting. You have an important message to say. You have incredible worth. I know this. Like this is coming straight from my heart into your ears. You are incredibly worthwhile. You have so much to say. You're not an imposter. You know what you're doing. Even when you don't know what you're doing, you are still a valid and worthwhile human being. And that's important. It's funny, imposter syndrome, because the only people who get it, the people who deal with it, are people who are, generally speaking, from the research I've done into imposter syndrome, the people who suffer from it are the people who have the depth of intelligence and character and expertise that it takes to do the very thing that they fear that they're unqualified to do. So if you suffer from imposter syndrome, hilariously, ironically, whatever the right word is to use right there, it's really validating, because only people who are extremely capable and intelligent of doing the thing are terrified that they can't actually do the thing. Now, there's a flip side to this with the scientific name that I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, where you actually aren't capable of doing the thing, but you think you're the greatest person at doing the thing. So this is like, I have not watched this in years, but there used to be, American Idol used to be a TV show, and half of the people auditioning would be really amazing, and then the other half of the people auditioning were, oh, thank you, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Thank you, Pete. The people who would audition, many of them were terrible, like beyond deeply terrible, but they thought that they were incredibly amazing. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. So thank you for that, Pete. I appreciate you supplying that word for me. So yeah, if you have imposter syndrome, if you are afraid that somebody is going to discover you and call you out as a fraud, take heart. You can do the thing. You should be doing the thing. That is just further validation that you are smart and capable and you can do it. Funnily enough, at the end of the day, nobody knows what they're doing. I do a lot of public speaking, which you probably wouldn't guess by me sitting here rambling to you over this video, but I do a lot of public speaking, and when I get on stage, I talk, and then I finish talking, and inevitably somebody will come up to me at the end and say, how do you do that? How do you get up on that stage and talk? And basically what I tell them is, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just go up there and I talk, and it's like, I don't have a plan. I don't have a strategy. Nobody knows what they're doing. We're all just kind of flailing along, which is why you kind of just have to enjoy the journey. Enjoy the creative process. That's what we're here for. I want to make sure that I'm covering all the points that I promised you I would cover. Dealing with your imposter syndrome and releasing your show with confidence comes from just leaning into it. It comes from understanding that every bright, intelligent, and capable person feels like an imposter. Doing the best with what you can is all we can do. And I hope that you are able to find passion in podcasting and really, really enjoy the process. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. Ways that you didn't know you were holding yourself back. Imposter syndrome and perfectionism both are deeply rooted in fear. I talk about fear a lot. Fear is one of those, it's one of my favorite things to talk about because everybody has fear. Even if you think you're fearless, I bet you have some fear. We've talked extensively about my fear of live streaming. And yet here I am, live streaming in front of you. And after this live stream is over, I'm going to send out a link to this live stream, to the replay video, to my entire email list. This is terrifying, but I'm doing it anyway. When we talk about fear, a lot of people talk about kicking fear to the curb or punching fear in the face or getting rid of your fear entirely. That's not something we can do. I want to be very honest about that. I get up to speak on stage and I do it regularly in front of thousands of people, and I'm scared every time. So I don't want to talk about getting rid of fear because fear is a survival instinct. At the end of the day, we have fear to keep us safe. And I feel like we villainize fear in an interesting way. So I don't want to talk about getting rid of fear. I have a very good friend whose father was killed by a drunk driver. And I talked to him once about how he ended up forgiving the person who did this to his family. And how he got over the anger and how he dealt with it. And he said, and this is, I will never ever forget this, but he said, I didn't get rid of the anger. I have to forgive this person every day when I wake up. And I feel like dealing with fear is very similar. It's an instinct, it's a feeling, it's an emotion. You're never going to get it to go away. But what we can do is manage it. We have a lot of different fears. There's some easy ones to identify, and then there's some trickier ones to identify. Easy fears to identify are fear of failure. Nobody wants to fail. That's scary. And you look bad. More insidious fears are, like we talked about earlier, perfectionism. That's fear masquerading as something good, but ultimately holds us back. Similarly, there exists a thing called fear of success. And this does not get talked about ever. But I think it's even more prevalent for creators, so for podcasters, for writers, than the fear of failures. I think that we have, as a society, sort of embraced failure, like, oh, fail forward, and you learn by failing. But fear of success? I've talked to so many podcasters who have been stopped in their tracks, who have stopped what they're doing because they say, what if I blow up? What if I get too big? What if I get too famous and I lose myself or I lose who I am? I talked to other writers and podcasters who suffer from fear of success and they don't know that that's what they're suffering from. And they'll say things like, yeah, I created this thing, but now that bar is set really high. And if I keep succeeding, I'll have to keep like topping the last thing I did. And I don't want to have to do that. So I'm just going to stop. It's fear of success. We have fears of being seen, of being judged, of being vulnerable, of being not enough. Cheyenne says fear might not be fun, but it's necessary. Absolutely. Which seems really cruel, doesn't it? But again, it all comes down to how we manage it and how we recognize it when it shows up in our lives. Fear showing up as perfectionism can keep us from achieving great things. Fear showing up in our reaction as we reach toward a hot stove or a fire, that's a healthy fear. That's the kind of fear that actually does what it's supposed to do and keeps us safe. The fear of running out into traffic and the fear of the pain when you get hit by a bus, that's when fear is doing its job. It's keeping you safe. Unfortunately, there's a sliding scale of risk and safety in our brains. And sometimes our fear instinct gets a little overzealous. So yes, we should be afraid of touching the fire or sticking our fingers into the electrical sockets or making fun of the grizzly bear, right? These are things that we should not do. But fear also stops us from growing in a good way and changing in a good way. And fear tells us lies. Fear tells us that, oh, you'll be safe if you don't start a podcast. You'll be safer. You won't be judged. You won't be criticized. You'll be safe. You'll be safe if you never grow and if you never change. You'll be comfortable if you never grow and you never change. These are the kind of things that will hold you back from making a true and real difference in the world through your podcast. Cheyenne says, oh, I definitely have the fear of success thing. A friend of mine joked about me getting enough traction to end up on Ellen or something, and I nearly had a heart attack. I think that counts. Yes. Yeah. Because it resets the expectations. It resets the bar, which means we have a lot more growing to do. And that's freaking scary. And again, we can't get rid of our fears. There's never going to come a day when you're like, well, my fear is gone. Time to go roast some marshmallows. I don't know. I don't know why that was the first thing that came to my head. Maybe I really I'm doing this no sugar thing. And so I'm really thinking about marshmallows. But there's never going to come a day when your fear is just magically gone. You have to manage it. And so what I'm learning to do, because this is, I feel, a lifelong practice, is to say, fear, when you start to feel the fear bubbling up in your chest or in your throat, when you feel it physically starting to kick in and be like, you're thinking about starting a podcast. Let's just keep you safe over here. When you feel that start to bubble up, acknowledge it. Remember, we don't have to be perfect. We're not perfectionists anymore. We can say, I have a feeling of fear, and that's okay. Acknowledge the fear and say, okay, I'm feeling really fearful. Again, I'm just going to keep using this live stream as an example. I'm terrified of doing this live stream. I'm going to acknowledge it. And I've told you that many times during the live stream, so it's very meta at this point. And thank you, fear. Thank you. Thank you for wanting to keep me safe. That's very sweet of you. Fear, I see you. I acknowledge you. I thank you for wanting to keep me safe. That is so sweet. That is so caring of you, fear. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lift you out of the driver's seat and put you in the passenger seat, or even better, I'm going to toss you into the back seat because you're not driving. I acknowledge that you exist. I thank you for existing and keeping me safe. I like that all my fingers aren't burned off and that I'm not electrocuted and that I haven't fought a grizzly bear. So thank you. Thank you for keeping me safe. But I'm going to put you safely to the side. This is something that you have to do every day. You don't do it just once. You do it every day. You do it every day. And it does get a little easier. It's the reason I'm doing a live stream right now. My friend Jimmy is here in the comments, and I'm so grateful. Jimmy says, you once told me I could tell my fear. I know you are just trying to protect me from danger, and I thank you for that, but I choose to do this. It'll be okay. And that's true. I'm choosing to do this live stream. You're choosing to start a podcast. You're choosing to move forward with your podcast. You're choosing this. And there's so much power in that. There is so much power when you take action despite your fear. Like, have you ever done that? Have you ever put your fear safely to the side and moved forward into something challenging and new? It's a great feeling. And I hope that you feel that with your podcast. We talked about a couple things today in our live stream. We've talked about perfectionism, what it is, where it comes from. It comes from fear. It comes from the concern, the worry, the fear that we're not enough, that we'll be judged, that we're too human, that we're too vulnerable. We talked about what imposter syndrome is and how to move forward despite that. We talked about fear and how it holds us back and how we need to acknowledge that it exists and thank it for keeping us safe and then choosing to move forward bravely. I was speaking with Kate from the Ignorance Was Bliss podcast last night. She was gracious enough to host me on her show, and we had like a 2-hour conversation. It was fantastic. But she told me that acts of courage are not practiced in the absence of fear. So if you're ever being brave, it's not because you don't have fear. It's because you're choosing to act despite being afraid. It's putting your fear in the back seat and saying, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm going to accept that keynote gig. I'm going to go on stage for the first time. I'm going to record my first podcast episode. I'm terrified, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do a live stream for 47 minutes. I am really happy that you're here with me. I'm really happy that you're witnessing this live. This is really meaningful to me, and I'm very grateful that you're here in this live stream. Thank you for being here. Thank you for walking through this with me. Because that's the other thing, is that we're not alone. We're not doing any of this alone. I know that it's easy to feel alone, especially as a podcaster, when you are literally alone in your office with just a microphone in front of you and maybe some towels or some foam. You're not alone. You are alone together. You are with all of us in this community, in this literal Facebook community of seriously successful podcasters, and this figurative community, this online community, this band of people crazy enough to sit in front of a microphone and tell their story and to share a message that's important and life-changing and true. So, thank you for being brave. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Thank you for sitting with me as I explored these topics with you. I hope that they were helpful. I really do. I hope they were helpful. I would love you to take something away from this. And so after tonight's live stream, if you are able to sit down and think about the ways in which you are expressing perfectionism or imposter syndrome or fear, and just start thinking about, how can I move forward despite this? Or how can I begin to manage this? Or what do I need to realize or learn or become in order to grow? All right. I'm going to release you. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving here in the United States. So I want to say that I'm grateful for you. And I hope that you are grateful for many things in your life. I hope that there are a lot of beautiful things in your life. And I think I'm going to sign off. So again, thank you for being here. I hope that you took something away from this experience, and I will see you in the Seriously Successful Podcaster group. All right, bye for now.